I'm Robert Kleinberg from Cambridge, Massachusetts. Always a pleasure to be speaking here at Meta. Topic for today, as Evan said, is the European Union approach to methane emission control. I'd also like to acknowledge my colleague, Tim Boersma, who I've been working with on this subject. So let's get started. Okay. So first of all, we're going to be talking about the European Union, which is not the same as Europe. European Union, it comprises 27 nations. And for our purposes, there are two important European countries that are not in it. Those are the two biggest producers of oil and gas in Europe, that namely the United Kingdom and Norway. So the fact that they are not in it makes them external to this conversation, which can be an important point. It won't come up specifically, but I just want to point that out. The other nations that aren't in the European Union are Switzerland, Albania, former Yugoslavia, so not too important in the energy world. The European Union is the world's largest importer of natural gas. In the last several years, the world has consumed about 4,000 billion cubic meters of natural gas a year, of which the 27 nations of the European Union have consumed 1/10. And even more to the point, 89% of that consumption has been imported. So Europe only produces about 11% of its own natural gas, only about 5% of its crude oil. In fact, that fraction of domestic production is going to be going down even further because the Netherlands is about to close down its very famous Groningen field. That's going to be shut down permanently on October 1st, according to a recent article in Bloomberg. And that's Europe's biggest gas field. So if you look at sort of greenhouse gas emissions and especially methane emissions, much of which comes from the upstream, certainly the methane part comes from the upstream and midstream, Europe is much more concerned about its suppliers' methane emissions than its own methane emissions. So that is a main driver for what's going on now in the European regulatory space. So that right away brings us to the subject of discriminatory trade restrictions. Now, the only meaningful way Europe can reduce emissions of methane associated with the oil and gas it consumes is by reducing emissions in the supply chains of its foreign suppliers. Now, we all know suppliers are not equally assiduous in measuring and reducing life cycle emissions from wellhead to point of entry in Europe. And in fact, Tim and I just have completed an article pointing out what the effect of the Russian invasion of Ukraine has had on probable relationship between Europe and its methane-emitting suppliers. Therefore, European nations are going to need to discriminate against fossil fuels with high or unknown life cycle emissions. And this discrimination can be implemented by tariffs, which are also known as border adjustments, or other import restrictions. But in order to avoid being penalized with countervailing tariffs by the Free Trade Encouraging World Trade Organization, measures discriminating against imports must apply equally to domestic producers. And that's what drives a lot of the legislative strategy that the European Union is now going through. So this is a chart of the governing structure of the European Union. I am not going to go through every box. I don't really have time in this brief half-hour talk. But it has some similarities to the United States government structure, but also a lot of differences. Basically, as you'll see in a minute, so I'm just going to go right on to what's actually happening with the so-called proposal for a regulation of the European Parliament and of the Council on methane emissions reduction in the energy sector. So I am going to go through this chart. So we start with the European Commission up here, top center. They are the ones that propose legislation that applies to the European Union. And for the purpose of this methane emission reduction, that proposal was submitted on the 15th of December, 2021. It went to the Council of the European Union, which is not the same as the European Council. That is a totally different branch of government. You should be aware that there's two different things. This is the legislative piece. It spent a year pondering the proposal from the European Commission, and a year later, on the 15th of December, 2022, came out with a general approach and amendments to the European Commission proposal. That went to Parliament, and the European Parliament, 705 members, they also spent several months amending it, and that now goes to what's called trilogue, which is a negotiation between the original proposing European Commission, the second house, the Council of the European Union, and the Parliament. They all get together to negotiate. Hopefully it's a friendly negotiation where they sort of iron out their differences. The result of that is resubmitted to the two legislative branches, the Parliament and the Council. If accepted, that becomes EU law. At that point, it goes back to the European Commission in what is called the enforcement stage. I have enforcement in quotes because the European Commission is not particularly powerful. Most of the enforcement is done through the individual nations, but the European Commission does sort of coordinate that. So that's the sort of big picture of what has to happen for a bill to become law in Europe. So European Commission starts the process with its proposal. However, the European Commission is largely ignorant of the oil and gas industry, but fortunately, it knows it's ignorant and has gone to outside sources of information to construct its proposal. Primary sources of information are first, the US Environmental Protection Agency, particularly the Quad O and Quad OA regulations. Not too surprising, Europe looked to the US. The US does set standards for the global petroleum industry writ large, both in technology and in regulation. So that's why we in the United States need to be particularly careful about how we write our regulations, because the rest of the world is, let's face it, at best going to be copying it. No one's going to exceed US standards by and large. So in the Quad OA regulations, it's a very interesting point, and perhaps not sufficiently recognized by us, that fugitives and vented methane are treated very differently. They're treated separately and differently in our Quad OA regulations. The European Commission also looked to the Oil and Gas Methane Partnership, OGMP. The reason to look there is also pretty obvious. OGMP now consists of about 100, it might be more than that now, 100 oil and gas companies, the United Nations Emission Environment Program, the NGO heavy hitters, the Environmental Defense Fund and the Clean Air Task Force, and the European Commission itself sort of signed on in advance. And what the European Commission has taken away from OGMP protocols is mostly the bottom-up versus top-down reconciliation, which we're going to talk about in a minute. So let's talk about fugitive versus vented methane. And I think almost everyone on this call takes what I call the physical science point of view to fugitive versus vented methane. Basically, the heart of it is that you can't manage what you don't measure. And most of our favorite methods, satellites, aerial methods, drive around, mobile methods, and so on, don't distinguish between leaks and vents. And we have always considered, well, that's okay. Methane is methane. It all warms the earth, whether it's from a leak or a vent. So why are we worrying about the distinction? The physical science point of view is also not very concerned about the operational details of the industry. Basically, the point of view is that if it's emitting methane, it's bad, and we need to fix it, and we don't really care why it's emitting methane. Now, the EPA, which is very much influenced by industry, who is the main source of their information, has a very different point of view. And in contrast to us, the EPA and industry are not really all that concerned about measurements. Measurements are complicated, the qualification procedures are onerous, and they don't reduce methane anyway. If you're just measuring it, you're not reducing it. On the other hand, they are very concerned about operational details. Leaks are viewed as generally small and not intermittent. So it is okay for 3 or 6 months to go by between leak checks because they're small, and you're going to catch them because they're not intermittent. On the other hand, vents are often from safety equipment operating as designed. The primary purpose of venting methane is to prevent tanks from blowing up, and nobody wants a tank to blow up. Now, the third point that is very important to industry is that anything that increases costs is bad. So they don't want anything that increase costs. So you can see that this dichotomy between vents and fugitives shows up in Quad OA very clearly if you look at it closely. There is a whole bunch, and so what I'm doing here is the primary standards that are in Quad OA. Vents are covered in a series of sections in 40 CFR subpart 60 or subpart 60. And there are design and process rules that apply to wells, that apply to compressors, that apply to pneumatic controllers, that apply to pneumatic pumps, and to tanks. And these are design rules. So they tell you, you must reduce emissions by 95%, and you must direct your excess methane to control devices. But none of these have any measurements in them. They're all engineering directions of how you have to build things in order to prevent vents or to minimize vents. On the other hand, all the measurements are in the fugitives in the leak detection and repair rules, which are in 60.5397A. And this is where all the measurements are. So when you talk about method 21, the sniffer, or talk about optical gas imaging, it's all directed to fugitives, not to vents. Excuse me. So let's have a look at the what is formerly called the proposal for a regulation of the European Parliament and of the Council on methane emissions reductions in the energy sector. So as I said, the European Commission came first. That's its job, to basically make the proposal. And I've put here all the links so you can look it up for yourself. Council of the European Union was next, and then the Parliament on May 3rd. So let's look first at how this proposal deals with fugitive methane. That's in Article 14. So the European Commission's proposal said that you have to do this leak detection and repair survey every 3 months. That's okay if you're looking for something small that is not intermittent. And in carrying out these surveys, operators shall use devices that allow detection of loss of methane from components of 500 parts per million or more. Now, many people on this call recognize 500 parts per million as a specification that's found in the US regulations. However, the bad thing about Article 14 is that it mandates the use of EPA Method 21, and no other surveys are authorized. I'm going to repeat that. No other survey methods are authorized, nothing but Method 21, which basically has been regarded as antique and outmoded for years. So before reading Article 14, I was kind of neutral on these European regulations. Well, what are they up to? After reading Article 14, my head blew off. So that's kind of the origin of this talk, in fact. Now, that proposal got sent to the council. The council took a broader view of things, I have to say. And they identified two types of leak detection and repair. The FERT type 1 kind of looks like an optical gas imager, 7,000 parts per million or 17 grams per hour. Not exactly the same as what's in Appendix K, but more or less on the same track. And then so that's what I call a remote. And type 2 is what's called contact. And that's with the surveys with a minimum detection limit of 10 parts per million or 0.15 grams per hour of methane. So this certainly corresponds with a Method 21 type instrument. Many of them are capable of a 2 part per million, which is background methane concentration. So the contact method, they're thinking about Method 21. So they at least have recognized what's been going on for the last 20 years. Improvement. Now, the European Parliament weighed in, and they said, okay, you've got these two methods. We're going to specify they're at different frequencies. So if you're doing an OGI, you need to inspect once every 2 months. If you're doing a Method 21 type measurement, once every 4 months, because it is more sensitive. And then that operators shall repair or replace all components found to be leaking methane. So this is very much a leak detection and repair sort of protocol. Okay, let's look at vented methane, which is Article 12, which again is treated completely differently than fugitives. So in paragraph 1, the Commission proposed that 12 months after regulation has been approved, operators shall submit a report containing source level methane emissions estimated using generic but source specific emission factors for all sources. This we recognize as equivalent to OGMP level 3. It's also the current practice of the US EPA for its greenhouse gas inventory. We have a 250-line spreadsheet with emission factors, very granular, very meticulously curated. No measurements here, but you have this big spreadsheet. Paragraph 2 says 24 months after date of entry into force, operators will also submit a report containing direct measurements of source level methane emissions. So this is OGMP level 4. So this is where you're checking to see that your emission factors are correct. And then 3 years later, and then every year thereafter, you submit a report with the OGMP level 4 measurements plus, and this is important, complemented by measurements of site level methane emissions. So now we finally got to what we might call top-down sort of measurements, the ones that are done by aircraft or satellites, just to check overall, make sure that what's coming out of a site equals the addition of all those individual component emissions that you have put on your spreadsheet. And that's OGMP level 5. So pretty clear where this is coming from. Now, what is the measurement technology that is being specified in this legislative proposal? Well, the European Commission said, we are going to use either the European Committee for Standardization method of measuring methane emissions or the International Organization for Standardization method. Now, I'm not an expert in these ISO types type standards. However, I did sort of thumb through it. And it looks pretty primitive. So I'd say probably the European Commission is hoping that the ISO and CEN will get its act together within a year or a couple of years, I guess, is what they'll need, and have something ready to go. The Council took a different approach. They threw the problem back on the European Commission and said, okay, you solve this. European Parliament had yet a third way, OGMP methods until the international standards are adopted. Now, OGMP also has not really written formal specifications for how to make these measurements. It's sort of like, do whatever you want. I'd say we've got a long way to go in understanding what measurement technologies are actually going to be required by the European Union. Okay, so now let's move on to really the most important part of this picture, which is the extraterritoriality. This is in Articles 27 through 29 plus Annex 8. Much of the requirements that are specified in these articles is what I call certification of good behavior. So the European Union is going to look at its sources of fossil fuels and ask the following questions. Are you a Paris Agreement signatory? Are you a Global Methane Pledge signatory? Do you have reports on regulatory or voluntary measures to reduce methane emissions? Do you have reports on leak detection and repair surveys, venting, flaring, where they are available? If they're not available, well, then no problem. They're going to be looking for status of measurement reporting verification requirements. They're going to be looking to see whether the company that's exporting to Europe is in the oil and gas methane partnership and what status they are. And finally, really the only numbers, as far as I can tell, the only numbers that the European Union is really going to ask for are in the United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change reports, which are the self-reports of emission factor method inventories based on spreadsheets and no measurements. So that's what I call the certification of good behavior. But there's also an out. The out is, or all reasonable efforts have been undertaken to acquire this information. Not what I would call super strict methods in terms of trying to exert extraterritorial control over your supply chain of fossil fuels. And in short, there is certainly no proof of meeting any kind of performance standard at all. Okay. However, there is provision for what the EU is calling a global monitoring tool. And I'm just going to read this. Direct quote. The Commission shall establish a global methane monitoring tool based on satellite data and input from several certified data providers and services, including the Copernicus component of the EU space program, which is, of course, more satellites. So basically, what the European Union is going to be looking for is confirmation from satellites, which, when you think about it, is probably not a bad approach because there's lots and lots of oil and gas producers that are just not going to be friendly toward you flying your airplane over their oil fields. Satellites, they can't really do much about. Let's see. Here we go. Okay, so just to summarize what I've told you, first, fugitives. In the EU formulation, fugitives are small but continuous emissions that can arise in equipment that is aging or poorly designed or assembled. The emphasis is on find and fix, not quantification, because you don't get quantification from Method 21 and rarely from OGI. The instrumentation is indeed Method 21 sniffer or maybe an optical gas imager deployed a few times per year. And as far as I can tell, EU legislation is headed toward highly specific and inflexible prescriptions. In regard to vents, the EU emphasis is on top-down, bottom-up reconciliation as per OGMP level 5. That's where they intend to be 3 years after this thing is signed into law. The European Commission and European Parliament propose relying on European or international measurement standards, which, as far as I can tell, have yet to be written. And the Council of the European Union proposes the European Commission write the measurement standards. So assuming this proposal survives, technology developers would be well advised to be involved in OGMP, CEN, and ISO standard setting. That's just a word to the wise. Let's see. There's one more page here. I just have to make this happen. There. Finally, summary on extraterritoriality. The EU will compile catalogs of good behavior. The primary data it will collect is from UNFCCC reports, which are self-reported emission factor estimates with satellite data as a check. These approaches have known reliability and accuracy problems, as I documented in my paper on fossil fuel industry emissions from the Russian Federation. But bottom line here, probably this is all that can be done realistically in the foreseeable future. So with that, I'm going to open it open to discussion and questions. My email address is in red here, and I expect that this talk will be on the Meta YouTube channel presently. So thank you very much.